This meeting is being recorded.
What's going on now?
Who do you think you are kidding, Mr. Hitler, if you think we're on the run? We are the boys who will stop your little game. We are the boys who will make you think again. 'Cause who do you think you are kidding, Mr. Hitler, if you think old England's done?
So, that's the famous Dad's Army beginning, and the popular narrative of the first 18 months of the Second World War goes something like this. The Germans invade Poland, forcing Britain to declare war. The Wehrmacht, the German army, sweeps through Poland. Denmark and Norway are invaded and conquered. In June 1940, Germany attacks the Low Countries and France. Their highly efficient mechanised army pushed aside the French, Dutch and Belgian troops and forced the British to retreat to Dunkirk. Here there is a miracle as hundreds of little boats manned by civilians rescue thousands of soldiers to live and fight another day. Britain then stood alone, waiting for the inevitable German invasion, with only the Dad's Army of local defence volunteers, later called the Home Guard, made up of old and infirm men with no military training and obsolete weapons. First though, the Luftwaffe has to defeat the RAF and control the skies. Only then could they cross the English Channel. Once here, with only the Home Guard to resist them, they would have conquered Britain and won the war. The Luftwaffe vastly outnumbered the RAF, but the few stopped them in their tracks, and the Germans resorted to terror bombing but failed to dent the morale of the British people, and so Hitler's plan to invade Britain was abandoned. On the home front, everybody pulled together with a common goal, helping each other out in adversity in what became known as the Blitz spirit. So that's the popular conception. But of course, the reality is a bit more complicated and I think more interesting. So we'll look at what really happened from September 39 to the early months of 1940.
United we shall stand, whatever may befall, the richest in the land, the poorest of us all. We must all stick together, birds of a feather, and the clouds will soon roll by.
Britain's involvement in the Second World War began on the 3rd of September 1939, 2 days after the German invasion of Poland. It became obvious that Hitler could not be appeased, and Britain and France had given assurances to Poland that they would declare war against Germany in the event of an invasion. France had promised to attack Germany from the west. Britain was committed to immediately launching bombing raids. They were still trying to prevent the war and convince Warsaw that a premature call-up might give Hitler the excuse to attack. The Poles had delayed the order for general mobilisation of the army until the 28th of August, but then cancelled it the next day when the British and French urged them to hold back in the last-minute hope of negotiations. It was finally reissued once more on the 30th of August. These changes caused chaos. There were only about a third of Poland's 1.3 million badly armed soldiers were in position on the 1st of September. On the 17th, the Soviet Union invaded Poland from the east, taking back land they had fought over in 1920. The Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact had a secret clause in which they agreed to carve up the Polish state that had only existed since 1919. Britain and France did nothing, and the Poles felt betrayed. Their whole plan of defence was based on holding back the Germans long enough for the Western Allies to relieve them by attacking from the west. After World War I though, the French had developed a defensive mindset and were terrified of attacking until they had increased the size of their army. The British were fearful of German bombing raids in retaliation if they started bombing Germany. The idea at the time was that the bomber will always get through, and it dominated British thinking, and they thought if there was any raids on London, it would result in millions of dead. After the war, German generals said that if they had been attacked by the West, they could not have stopped it. Then came the Phoney War, which was a period from 1939 up to the invasion of the Low Countries and France. Hitler was still hoping that Britain and France would agree to a peace while they were still fearful of attacking Germany. The British were convinced that a naval blockade would be effective on its own, as it was in the previous war. On the 30th of November 1939, the Soviet Union attacked Finland in what became known as the Winter War. Plans were made by Britain and France to send troops to aid Finland and to also launch an invasion of neutral Norway and Sweden to cut off Germany's supply of iron ore and steel. The Germans knew about these plans and it alarmed them, so to stop it they invaded Denmark and Norway. Despite Allied troops landing in Norway, Germany quickly gained the upper hand and the Allied troops were withdrawn. The invasion of Netherlands, Belgium, Luxembourg and France began on the 10th of May. As planned, British and French troops entered Belgium to halt the Germans, but a surprise push through the Ardennes saw the German motorised units break through and cut off the Allied troops. The British had to evacuate troops from Dunkirk, mainly by naval destroyers. The Germans halted their advance, and by the time it resumed, over 300,000 troops had been got off the beaches, but most of the heavy equipment had to be left behind. Paris was occupied unopposed on the 14th of June, and on the 22nd of the same month the French formally surrendered. Now, it's often thought that the Wehrmacht was a highly mechanised and modern army in 1939. In fact, 90% of the army was still dependent on horsepower and men marching on foot. There were only a few fully mechanised units that could move swiftly. It was the British army that was fully mechanised and probably the best equipped of all. It was because the Germans had swept through Poland and then France in a matter of weeks. Blitzkrieg, or lightning war, was coined, and their reputation for swift, decisive attacks was cemented. The Germans never actually used the term Blitzkrieg. Their initial plan for the West was a near run of the Schleifenpan in the World War I. The German General Staff opposed any invasion, fearing it would lead to a war of attrition which they would never win. At the last moment, a plan was drawn up by General Erich von Manstein, called Case Yellow. This proposed an attack with mechanised armoured units through the supposedly impenetrable Ardennes. It was intended to be a diversion, but documents with details of the original plan fell into Belgian hands, meaning that more emphasis was given to the attack through the Ardennes, which progressively reduced the offensive through the Low Countries to being a diversion. This plan was so successful because the German mechanised divisions disobeyed orders to halt and just continued in their advance. Many of the panzer groups had simply switched off their radios. The halt was called just before Dunkirk, and this enabled the evacuation, but it was halted to enable the German General Staff to regain control of the situation. The speed of the fall of France shocked the German generals as much as the Allies. Of course, Hitler later claimed it was his plan all along, and the victory was due to his military genius. This and the swift conquest of Poland saw the reputation of the German lightning war tactics become embedded in the consciousness of the British public that then fed into the fear of an invasion. With France defeated, many in Britain feared that a German invasion was imminent. In Parliament, Churchill gave his finest hour speech, in which he said that the Battle of France was over and the Battle of Britain was about to begin. It's since been argued that the Battle of Britain is an artificial term, which has little meaning. Even at the time, there were different interpretations of when it started and when it ended. The Germans never thought of it as a different battle, just another phase of their continued air attacks that had begun in 1939. Today, this phase of the battle is dated from July 1940, when the Luftwaffe began targeting coastal shipping convoys as well as the southern ports. On the 1st of August, the Luftwaffe was directed to achieve air superiority and incapacitate fighter command. It shifted the attacks to the RAF airfields and infrastructure. The Luftwaffe also targeted factories involved in aircraft production and strategic infrastructure. From the 7th of September, it began full-scale bombing of London. Although early on, the Luftwaffe did have more aircraft than the RAF, it was limited in that their best fighter, the Messerschmitt 109, was operating at the limit of its range and could only stay over Britain for 10 minutes before having to return. British aircraft production far outstripped the Germans, with twice as many being produced month on month, meaning Britain soon had many more aircraft. The Luftwaffe was conceived and set up to provide air support for ground troops, with the Stuka dive bomber that wrought terror when used in Poland and France, proving to be useless when faced with much faster, better armed and more manoeuvrable British fighters. Most importantly, the British also had radar, the first integrated defence system ever, with the ability to precisely track incoming enemy planes. These were linked to a command centre that could then direct fighters to intercept. This meant that the RAF pilots could stay on their bases and wait for the call to get airborne, instead of wasting time and fuel constantly patrolling, hoping to catch oncoming Germans. There was a few attempts to bomb the radar stations, and some were put out of commission for a short time, but the Germans never realised that. The first mistake made by the Germans was the decision to switch attacks from the radar stations to concentrate on the airfields. RAF pilots could fly 3 or more sorties a day, and if they had to bail out or crash land, they could be back at their base in the same day. The German pilots, if they survived, would inevitably be captured. The second mistake the Germans made was to switch from trying to defeat the RAF to bombing cities, especially London. The theory before the war was that the intense bombing raids on civilians would quickly shatter morale and, under pressure from its citizens, force a government to seek peace. Contrary to what was thought, the German bombers did not deliberately target civilian areas. Their aim was for the docks, munition factories and war-related industry. The reason the casualty rate was so high in Britain compared to later in the war, when Germany was bombed, was partly due to the lack of suitable shelters in working class districts, especially in the docklands of the East End, that were close to the centre of the bombing. There was also the simple lack of accuracy of the bombing due to the inadequate equipment of the time. A major problem for the Germans was that they did not have the heavy bombers that could inflict the sort of damage that they were aiming to do. During the 8-month period, 7th of September 1940 to 11th of May 1941, around 18,000 tons of bombs were dropped on London. 3 years later, in the Battle of Berlin, the RAF managed to drop 80,000 tons in half the time. The name given to the plan to invade England was Operation Sea Lion. Hitler had asked for a plan to invade in 1939, but it was never taken seriously by the German armed forces, who saw it as a hypothetical exercise. From the beginning, the German Navy, the Kriegsmarine, said it was impossible to invade unless both the RAF and, more importantly, the Royal Navy were defeated and unable to interfere with any crossing. The Wehrmacht initially thought the crossing of the Channel would just be like crossing a very wide river, not knowing about the strong currents and so on in the Channel. The Luftwaffe didn't even take part in any discussions, as Göring, its head, was insistent that they alone would be able to defeat Britain, so any invasion would simply be a case of confirming a German victory. The army did envisage a wide-scale landing, with all the troops landed in 2 days on a wide front. The Kriegsmarine, having lost several ships during the invasion of Norway, were insistent that even if an invasion was possible, it would have to be a narrow landing east of Beachy Head, and even then they said it would take 17 days to ferry troops across. Hitler was hopeful that the British would see the hopelessness of their situation and sue for peace. He instructed the Luftwaffe to destroy the RAF, so then, he reasoned, Britain would surely surrender. He had always seen a future where Germany dominated Europe, especially Eastern Europe, and Britain would have its empire, and together they could dominate the world. To preserve the illusion that an invasion was imminent, preparations were begun. The Germans had no landing craft, so they improvised by requisitioning hundreds of barges that were used on inland waterways of Germany and building up their sides to resist the swell of the English Channel. Besides their obvious unseaworthiness, they were unpowered, usually towed by horses. To deal with this, they decided to use small tugs to tow several barges at once, full of troops or tanks. In Britain, the fear of an invasion was fuelled by Churchill himself, who publicly at least continued to emphasise the need to resist. In private, he told close confidence that he believed there was no chance of a German invasion, but to keep insisting on and highlighting the possibility was beneficial to keep the country in a state of preparedness and prevent any talk of a compromise. He even shot some of his generals when he sent troops and tanks overseas to Egypt in 1940 to strengthen the defence of the Suez Canal. It's not something you would do if an invasion was expected at any moment. There had only been a short period in which the Germans had any hope of launching an invasion of southern England. That window was rapidly closing when on 14th of September 1940 Operation Sea Lion was postponed. Everyone knew in reality that that was abandoned. Hitler, though, had a new plan to fulfill his main ambition, which was to destroy the Soviet Union. Although always the primary object, the plan to move east didn't come about in detail until December 1940. The German General Staff still thought that it was far too early to invade, but Hitler was buoyed up by his seemingly great generalship, military generalship, and justified it to his generals that with the defeat of the Soviet Union, Britain would have to surrender or at least come to terms. He convinced himself that Britain was now helpless and not a threat to his plans. We know most about the attitudes at this time through the Mass Observation Project, which was set up in 1937 to monitor and record the lives of ordinary people. It aimed to record everyday life in Britain through a panel of around 500 untrained volunteer observers who either maintained diaries or replied to open-ended questionnaires known as directives. The organisation also had paid investigators to anonymously record people's conversation and their behaviour at work. On the street at work on the street and at various public occasions, including public meetings, sporting and religious events. Many photographs were taken, and it's by far the best source of information from that time of everyday life in Britain. Although it must be remembered that the reports of working class behaviour were obviously second hand and filtered through the lens of the middle class observers who recorded them. It was not really liked by a lot of working class people who called the observers spies, eavesdroppers, nosy parkers, peeping toms, snoopers, envelope steamers and keyhole artists. Once the war began, the Ministry of Information was set up and used mass observation alongside their own agents to monitor the public. It was the Ministry of Information that produced the propaganda posters and issued advice in leaflets and booklets. Many found the advice patronising and simply ignored it. The famous poster "Keep Calm and Carry On" that saw a revival a few years ago was printed, but it was never actually issued due to negative reactions to it. Oh, that's gone out of sync. I seem to have lost a thing here. Ah, there it is. The Blitz spirit was invoked at the time, and as has been ever since, to portray the resolve and single-mindedness of the civilian population and resilience in the face of unexpected adversity. And it sustained a common bond between citizens facing a shared threat and remaining calm or cheerful despite calamity. Now, there is some truth in this, with many people pulling together and supporting each other. The extent of this, though, has been questioned. There was a huge increase in reported crime during the Blitz. There was widespread looting. There was the stealing of valuables from the dead, often done by supposedly trusted people like rescue workers, firefighters, police, soldiers and mortuary attendants. There was a rise in organised crime, with gangs running rackets. The most powerful was run by Billy Hill. His gang was involved in armed robbery, burglary and protection. They were also the biggest exploiters of the black market, which burgeoned with the advent of rationing and other arduous wartime restrictions and regulations introduced by the government. There was the Messina brothers, who ran brothels and shady nightclubs and had a vast army of professional girls known as the Piccadilly Commandos. They were on the streets to service the increased demand. The gang was able to carry on business with little intervention from the authorities thanks to widespread police corruption. Alongside this rise in prostitution, there was also a sexual revolution, with many taking advantage of the freedom given by the blackout to explore their sexuality to the full. Quentin Crisp, a famous, what did he call himself? Stately homo of England, I think it was, or something, said he found acceptance during the Blitz as gay men became bolder. Illegitimate births rose. There's a story of a warden of a public shelter asking, "Are there any expectant mothers in this shelter?" with a woman shouting back, "Give us a chance, we've only been here 10 minutes. Of course, there was the other side of the coin, with the rise in sexual assault and rape. Class divisions were obvious. The well-off were the main beneficiaries of the black market and fueled its growth. They hoarded food and had houses with cellars or had access to comfortable shelters like the one in the basement of the Savoy Hotel. The working class Londoners were supposed to stay above ground in the flimsy Anderson shelters, because it was thought if they went underground they would stay there and not come out again. But against government orders, they forced their way into the underground stations and used them as shelters. Many people were made homeless, and initially there was little thought or provision for them. The evacuation of children from major cities was also a mixed bag. During the phony war, many parents brought their children back home. There was widespread abuse of the system, with people pocketing the money provided for the upkeep of the children. There are also many stories of physical and sexual abuse. Anti-Semitic attitudes became widespread. Jews were accused of inflating prices and being responsible for the black market. It was alleged that they were the first to panic under an attack, or even the cause of the panic, and they always secured the best shelters. Foreigners were treated as suspicious, and racism reached new heights. Although the Ministry of Information knew about this through mass observation and their own sources, what they were more concerned about was the increase in class antagonism, with special attention being paid to some of the younger miners, especially in Scotland around Clydeside, who were expressing the view that the real enemy was still the bosses and not the Germans. It seems that the Blitz spirit was a very individual experience, and if anything, any real spirit was generated from below, with government agencies having to follow and adjust to the developing situation. What can be said is that the post-war expectations of better provision of healthcare, housing and so on began this time in 1940, when people were already talking about what Britain should look like after the war was won. There is an element of truth in the popular conception of the Home Guard. In the aftermath of Dunkirk, they were called upon to be part of the defence of Britain. However, what is little known is that there was a highly trained group of men, some in reserved occupations, that were expected to be a guerrilla force in the event of a successful invasion. They were called the Auxiliary Units and were a secret resistance network of highly trained volunteers prepared to be Britain's last-ditch line of defence during World War II. They operated in a network of cells from hidden underground bases around the UK. They were provided with the best equipment, with detailed instructions to harass the enemy. Until recently, little was known about this because the men never talked of it, and many took the secret to their grave. The consensus now is that there was never any chance of a successful German invasion of Britain. Even if the RAF had been neutralised, the Royal Navy was still the main obstacle to any crossing, and there was no way the Germans could defeat it. The barges that they envisaged being towed over the channel would have been unmanageable even in calm weather. The amount of time to ferry troops and equipment meant that even if they reached England, there would be too few to make an impact. In 1944, when the Allies invaded Normandy on D-Day, it was the result of 2 years of intense planning, with specially built landing craft, Mulberry harbours, specialist equipment, air superiority, a huge naval presence, and an overwhelming number of troops. It was the combined efforts of several countries with vastly superior resources than the Germans had in 1940. The debate is mainly centred around just how serious were the Germans. Hitler certainly hoped sea line would never be needed, and Göring was convinced that any invasion would be a simple task just to confirm German victory already secured by the Luftwaffe. The Kriegsmarine never thought it was viable, and the army hoped it would be a diversion and stop the talk of invading the Soviet Union. German generals after the war have said that the preparations were made in order to preserve an illusion of an invasion.
Don't run away, mister. Oh, stay and play, mister. Don't worry if you hear the sirens go, though. I'm not a lady of the highest virtue. I wouldn't dream of letting anything hurt you. And so before you go, I think you ought to know I've got a cozy flat. There's a place for your hat. I'll wear a pink chiffon negligee gown. And do I know my stuff? But if that's not enough, I've got the deepest shelter in town.
That was the deepest shelter in town, a popular song of the time. I thought you might all like to hear that. So, continue misconceptions of 1940. Of course, in England at the time, there was no way of knowing if an invasion was imminent. Most people took it as a fact that the Germans were preparing an invasion. Propaganda from both the British and the Germans confirmed this for them. Hitler wanted to break the morale of the British to force a peace. The British government emphasised the Britain alone trope to garner support from the United States, where there was little appetite to get involved in another European conflict. Roosevelt, the president, was looking for excuses to aid Britain, and the newsreels showing the air battles and the Blitz strengthened his position. After the war, this narrative was continued in popular culture. Films made during and after the war continued to promote the idea of a real threat of invasion of Britain standing alone. This can be seen through the 40s, 50s, 60s, culminating in the 1969 film Battle of Britain. Television programmes like Dad's Army also perpetuated the myth of make, do and mend, and the make, do and mend attitude to the defence of Britain, the muddling through approach that became part of British law that has continued to this day. Of course, those in authority like to invoke the war years and the Blitz spirit whenever there is a national emergency or crisis, especially the notion that we're all in the same boat and need to pull together. When the British are confronted with a national crisis, they default to talking about the Second World War still, especially 1940. At the beginning of the coronavirus pandemic, Boris Johnson, who sees himself as a latter-day Churchill, declared, and I quote, "We must act as in wartime and do everything it takes to support the economy." Matt Hancock, who was then the Health Secretary, called on Britons to emulate their grandparents' behaviour during the Blitz. Quote, "Despite the pounding every night, the rationing, the loss of life, they pulled together in one gigantic national effort." Throughout the Brexit referendum and after it, the war and the Blitz were invoked. Jacob Rees-Mogg compared the European Union to Nazi Germany and talked of how Britain stood alone before and it can do it again. As the prospect of a no-deal Brexit loomed, rationing and the Blitz were used to argue that Britain had nothing to worry about, and like before, Britain can take it. Comparisons with Britain in 1940, though, are fraught with difficulty, as they invoke an event that was mythologised as it happened. This is not to say there was not an immense bravery or a great effort by soldiers, sailors, airmen, firefighters, nurses, others, or that there was no Blitz spirit. Rather that the people's reactions were shaped by a variety of factors. People's personal experiences and expectations at the time meant totally different things to different people. The government then and governments since, aided by the media and popular culture, have used the events of the time to reinforce this myth. The way the Blitz has been remembered actually disguises the awful reality of the time, the awful reality of being bombed. The way Britain 1940 is remembered conceals the reality of that time and the realities of the present.
Welcome friends from overseas. I'm your guide, I aim to please. I know what you want from me. Sights and smiles and history. I'll take you down to the underground. That's where the spirit of the bliss is found. Hear those sirens over your head. See that platform, that's your bed. Who went mad, who's drowned in drink? Who's in a cage and who's extinct? Who ended up in a uniform? The lion and the unicorn.
There you go.